Hello.
Hola.
Bonjour.
Привет. 你好.
Hello and welcome to Language with Chu. As usual, here I am interested in language and more specifically in the origin of language and in the nature of language. What is language? We don't know. For some, it will be just a social skill. For others, it's something in the mind that is part of our cognitive system, let's say. For others, it's just a very specific skill. And I'm not convinced by any of the theories, frankly. But you may recall this diagram that I shared in one of the videos that I'll link to above, where I explained the different kinds of questions that you can ask about language. One is the language evolution, as in the evolution of languages. For now, we'll leave that aside, but it's the change of languages throughout history. What's most interesting to me right now is this part, the part that belongs to the species. Phylogenetic means for the species. And it's how did language evolve and how did it emerge into our reality, into our species. The main question that's been around for about 60 years, I believe, is whether language is an organ, or rather a module, but let's call it an organ for now for the sake of the slide. And this will be the focus of this video and probably a few others, because there's a lot to explore and a lot to distill from the information that is available, and you'll see how confusing it can be and how the questions that are asked are not very satisfactory, at least I think. Okay, so then this question, whether it's language is an organ or a module in our minds, has to do with several other questions here. Is it nature? Are we born with it? Or do we develop certain neural networks, let's say, as we grow up, as we learn language from our caretakers, for example? The other question is, well, is it a capacity that evolved slowly from gestures, say, or vocalizations? If you watch my previous videos, you know that I don't think that's possible, and why? Or is it a gradual jump, an evolutionary jump? Well, can it be? Because it's a very complex skill that you need to perform when you're using language, and as we'll see, it's linked to other areas of the brain as well. So could it be an abrupt jump in evolution? Maybe, but not in the way it's usually thought of, I think. And then finally, you watched my previous videos, I imagine, so is it God or Darwin? Darwin, we know there's many flaws in the theory. God, you can choose to call it God. For me, it's something more akin to intelligent design, and very little is known about what that creator, let's say, could be. But it could be many, it could be one, we don't know. But anyway, the main thing is language an organ or a module in the mind? Okay, the idea is that for it to be a mental module, this was started by Fodor, who he's not even a linguist, but a philosopher, I think, who worked in close relationship with Noam Chomsky, who's considered to be one of the father of modern linguistics. They said that basically it has to be innate, because children learn language very quickly, following a series of steps. The amount of stimulus that they get from their environment, they claim, is not enough for the child to develop language fully. Well, that's debatable, but we'll come to that later. So it has to be innate. We can't just develop it from growing up in a house that speaks, say, English. We have to have a certain area of the brain, certain physical part of our brain that processes grammar. I say grammar because vocabulary, they can't even say that we have the vocabulary. They have to admit that we have to learn the vocabulary. We'll see that in a minute. But another criteria for it being a module is that it has to be impervious to the working of the other. So if you break one part, if you have an injury, for example, in the brain, then language should stop working, and you should preserve all your other cognitive skills. They explained at the time, and now for 60 years, that it's a bit like a computer where you can remove the fan, for example, and the computer will still work. Well, there are some parts in the computer that you can't really remove and allow the computer to keep working. So it's a bit of a poor analogy overall, because the mind is and the brain is a lot more complex than a computer. But let's say that's what they claimed. Let's go with that for now. It has to be impervious to other modules. And then the third criteria is that it switches on. We have it, we're born with it, we learn, say, a certain amount of vocabulary, and then at one point, because it processes a unique type of information, that is grammar, syntax more specifically, it will turn on when it has enough input from the environment, when it has enough information to process. That's the idea of a module. And as I said, it deals with a specific type of information, so it won't be dealing with pragmatic, so the language in context in a real situation. It's just purely mathematical, almost mathematical, or calculations performed by the brain, specifically for grammar, nothing else. Okay, more conditions for it to be a module. I mean, if we're going to test the theory, let's go further, right? It has to have a dedicated neural structure, meaning that there's some part of the brain that will light up, that will activate when processing language. Second, it has to be dissociated from other cognitive abilities, like I said before. One area will be for processing math, the other one for art, the other one for language, etc. There won't be a crisscross of aptitude, say, or skills. And then third, there has to be a clear trajectory of development for it to be a module. So that means that a module as defined by them. That is that you have to reach a threshold of vocabulary, for example, as a child, in order to develop later grammar and the full scope of language. Okay, so let's go step by step. Is it a dedicated neural structure? You may have heard and you know that humans are the only species for whom the lateralization of the hemispheres is very strong. That is, we have the two brain hemispheres and they each perform different activities, as opposed to many animals whose activity is symmetrical. If this little part of the brain lights up for an animal, this one will light up too. So for us, it's a lot more complex because you see on neuroimaging that all kinds of areas in the brain are lighting up at the same time. Okay, so supposedly we're unique, so that lateralization could have something to do with language being a module, and supposedly language is predominantly on the left hemisphere. Nobody claims that it's exclusively on the left hemisphere, but it's believed that language is very heavy on the left hemisphere, and to a certain extent that's true. Okay, brain areas. For it to have a neural structure, they must be somewhere in the brain, right? So supposedly there are certain brain areas. These are the most common ones, but there's others. You may have heard of Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Is that the language the center or not? Third criteria for it to be a neural structure is, some people claim that it's because our brain is different from our ancestors and the skull size may have something to do with it. We'll see what that entails. And then there's genes. So is language in one gene? Maybe somebody has a mutation and they can't process language, so therefore, bingo, we have a gene for language. And then finally, if you can't find anything, you have to find something, because otherwise the whole theory needs to be thrown out of the window. If you can't find any location in the brain, any brain areas, anything in the shape or size of our brain, nothing in the genes, so then you have to find something, or otherwise the whole theory is wrong. Well, okay, now step by step, let's break those down into different categories. Lateralization. Okay, so what is known is that for different tasks that you call for, say reading a sentence as opposed to looking at an image and then describing it, so using language, different parts of the brain do light up in general. Now, the problem is that it's not just a matter of, okay, it always lights up in this specific place. People are different. What a surprise, right? So there's parts that activate on the right hemisphere, there's parts that activate on the left, and there's things that activate both sides on a similar location. The other interesting thing is that when 90% of the people, more or less, are right-handed. And for them, predominantly, language is more active on the left side. You know, the brain is crisscrossy. So the left hemisphere controls the right side, and the right hemisphere controls the left side. So for right-handed people, it seems that language is more active on the left. Left-handed people, however, show a very different distribution. There's like, I believe only 20% of them have it on the right hemisphere, which is what you would expect from that crisscross function, while something like 60% or 68% have it on the left still, and the others on both. It's not really sure where their language capacity or centers are. Okay, so I'll make another video in the future about it, because it's furiously interesting how actually each of these little areas activate in left-handed people, in right-handed people, and nobody actually knows where language is based on this criteria of lateralization. Many people who have atypical brain function, so for example, they call atypical even a left-handed person, will activate. You see these areas in the brain that activate all over the place. This is the right hemisphere, and this is the left hemisphere. There's no clear pattern as to where language is the most active. And they have perfect language, by the way. Huh? It doesn't mean that it's flawed in any way. If you've ever talked to a left-handed person, did you ever notice that they had any problem with language? No, because you can't. It's perfectly well developed. There's no difference, basically. Okay, so that's problem number one. No real lateralization proof. Let's turn into the areas of the brain. So if you have an injury in any of these areas, you have what is called aphasia. So you have a speech impediment of some sort, a language impairment. Broca is usually the one that doesn't allow you to talk fluently. So for example, a person with an injury in Broca's area may only be able to say yes, no, tomorrow, or ta 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 ta, something like that. They understand language, they can't produce it. Whereas for Wernicke's area, it's the opposite. They can speak practically fluently, but they won't understand simple tasks, simple sentences. They won't be able to tell you if a sentence is grammatical or not, etc. Okay, so that's, if this is true, then language may be in those areas, right? Knowing already that these areas are in the left hemisphere, and yeah, it's a bit tricky because of what I just said before. Okay, the problem is that Broca's area, for example, just that one, it's also involved in all these skills. Planning of nonverbal action, so it's got nothing to do with language. Recognizing discordant chord sequences in music, so it has to do with music, which is supposedly unrelated to language. It has mirror neurons. It allows you to recognize actions, gestures, well, hand shadows, all kinds of stuff that is not really language related. The other problem is that some people who were studied, who had an injury in Broca's area, recovered language very well later. So it's almost like language shifted to another area of the brain. Or in some cases, it's not even irreversible. The area just, even if it's still injured or scarred, it still manages to produce language, or the person manages to produce language. Not only that, but there's also many studies where, okay, the person has an injury, say a brain tumor or a seizure or something, and they say, okay, here it is, it's in Broca's area. No, because there was a whole set of other areas that got affected. So you can't say that it's for sure Broca's area that is damaged. It may be related to the other areas that were injured. And they can't really agree on Broca's location exactly. It's more or less in the ballpark, but according to who you ask and what MRIs you do, the area is not really well defined. Now here, as a parenthesis, keep in mind that when we talk about areas lighting up in the brain or whatever, you're talking about an MRI, which is showing, like in the previous slide, it was showing, areas, specific areas that are quite big. 1 cubic centimeter of that area that may be red on the MRI actually has millions of neurons. So which neurons inside that little square are activated? The science is not advanced enough to tell you that. So keep that in mind when we talk about an area. It could be very, very large, and maybe that means that there's a language module. I don't know, but let's keep digging. Okay, another argument: brain and skull size. Supposedly, well, it was thought that we have a bit bigger brain than our ancestors. It turns out that actually Neanderthals, for example, most likely had a bigger brain than we do, and supposedly they didn't have language, etc. So some people excuse it by saying, well, it must be in the shape. See how the shape is different here, and the shape is here. Maybe something in the skull is picking up on whatever. It's actually affecting the brain, and that's what makes us have language. Well, again, no area has been found. We don't know anything about it. All we know is that for sure our brain is bigger than other animals' brains, but there doesn't seem to be a pattern, a correlation between brain size or skull shape and language. So, brain and skull size, not really believable for a language module. Okay, then the second thing was dissociation between grammar and other cognitive abilities, meaning that if one is damaged, if grammar doesn't work, your brain stays intact, it works perfectly fine, right? And one of the main pieces of evidence that they found for that is certain genes. Now, genes are interesting because we don't really know how they work, but there's a famous one called FOX2P. It was present in a family in England who had a definite speech problem. They spoke like a tourist in a city. They say they couldn't master English very well at all, and the whole family had this problem. So they did genetic studies, and it turned out that they had a mutation on that specific gene. Well, one problem is that this gene is present in other animals, and it was also present in the Neanderthals. So unless you're willing to say that Neanderthals had language, it's not so sure that it was FOX2P. Plus, it's also related to other functions. It helps in lung development, I think, and the heart, and the gut lining, etc. It has many, many functions. It hasn't been isolated for language alone. But anyway, those people who had this mutation had a language. An SLI is called a specific language impairment. There are others. And it was speculated that they were, perfectly intelligent in all other areas, except for language. That's what made them think that FOX2P was this language gene, finally, that people had been looking for. On the opposite side of this spectrum, there's something called Williams syndrome or the chatterbox syndrome, and it's people who have a definite lower IQ, something like 50, and yet their language is pretty good. So they said, okay, that's further proof. You have to have it both ways. You have to have people who can master language very well and have a retardation of some sort, or no language or poor language and perfect intelligence. Well, it turns out that it's not so clear-cut because in reality, this family that had the FOX2P mutation did have other issues with motor skills, with general intelligence. Their IQ was lower, and so it was all kind of like a big show, big proof at the time, but actually it turns out that no, they're not. It's not sure that this mutation only affected their language capabilities. And on the other side of the spectrum, the Williams syndrome, they found out that yes, even though the people who have this syndrome were pretty good at language, they weren't good at language on everything, and they did have a big delay in learning. So for this, given the same age, they were much, much worse at language skills than somebody without this problem. So the bottom line is, even in genes, we haven't found something that is obviously targeting language, and that obviously has to do with language ability or grammar ability as a whole. It's all a mixture. If you lose one, you probably have problems in other areas. So it hasn't been isolated. Now, what happens with the anything question? We've seen that none of the previous ones really cut it for proving that that language is for sure a module in the brain, a specific area in the brain. Have they found anything? Well, no. Now they talk about non-coding RNA, microRNAs, methylation, patterning, blah, 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 all the ones you see written here. Basically, they don't know, so they think, well, maybe something in the chemical reactions or in the connections or something between neurons, in the synapses or something like that. But so they say, well, since we haven't found that it's wired into the brain, it must be some kind of a regulatory mechanism, some kind of network that almost lights up and disappears as you stop using language. So that's why it cannot be detected, etc., etc. Not very convincing until science catches up with all of that. Okay, and the final idea is that there has to be a clear trajectory of development, as I said. So first vocabulary, then grammar. If you want, you can pause this video and look at the chart here. That's just an example. It's never so clear cut, but the idea is that the baby will start with, say, syllables, ma, 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 ga, 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 etc. And then little by little, he will acquire more vocabulary. and the grammar will be practically non-existent. And then starting from 2 years old, their grammar explodes. So they have, and the main argument is that, parents don't always correct their children when they make mistakes because it's cute, and children can make up new sentences all the time that they've never heard. So the argument is that you can't have instilled that the child can't be repeating what he or she heard the adult say. Well, the problem is that there is no proof. There's actually more proof that vocabulary and grammar develop simultaneously, that you need a certain amount of words plus grammar, and then you go up a level and you learn more words and you develop your grammar. So it's never been an obvious division, and there's no obvious threshold starting which you start developing grammar. So there goes the idea that there's a clear trajectory, therefore grammar is separate. Okay, so what do they do with all of that? Usually linguists will say, well, it's a bit like, we still maintain that it's a bit like a Swiss knife. Each part, you can remove it or you can add it. It won't affect the general functioning of the brain. So therefore language must be somewhere. We don't know if it's a neural network, a gene, nothing. We have no idea where it is, but we know it is there. It's biological. We can be absolutely sure of that. Don't ask me why they can be so sure, because there's no proof yet. But whatever, that's what they say. Now the problem is that they have to admit that there's many areas of the brain that do light up at the same time, that it's not so clear cut, that there's not a definite Broca's area or Wernicke's area, etc. So they came up with the idea that maybe there is a master module that overrule, let's say, all the other modules. So if you need language plus you need the visual system, say, the master module is like Big Brother, will help you compute both things, the visual stimulus, for example, and language. Well, once again, if they can't find one module, much less this Big Brother master module, as they call it. But again, that's the theory. I'm just recounting the theory. Okay, so here comes the problem. If the mind is modular, as they claim, even allowing for the idea of a master module, it does presuppose the idea of a designer of some sort. You don't have computers out of the blue. There are engineers, hundreds of them, thousands of them, creating one of those microchips, creating a computer part, programming it, etc., etc. And the fact that the idea is that these modules, the attractive thing about the module idea is that each of them would have developed at different stages of evolution. But how can you assume that there's those different stages and different modules popping up in nature when now you have to allow for a master module? The master module would have had to be designed or evolved in the beginning for it to recognize the new modules, right? And why would it have been programmed to recognize modules that didn't exist? It doesn't confer any advantage. The whole thing is, as you know from my previous videos, a disaster when you try to explain things in a Darwinian way. So I allow for the possibility of a designer, designers, maybe it's all information, consciousness, we don't know, but I don't think that it can be just random mutations, as I explained several times before. Okay, so what if it wasn't in the brain, since we can't find it and science is not that behind? I mean, yes, it is behind in many aspects, but they can plug you into electrodes, they can check your brain, they can show you an MRI, etc. So far it hasn't been found in the brain. Maybe it's outside of it, or some parts of language are outside of it, as in there is information or consciousness all around us, and we pick up. All we have in our brain is almost like the brain is the interface for picking up and processing information. And it would work almost like the brain being an antenna. And that would solve some problems that we have with these theories. For example, the problem of the poverty of stimulus, that is when parents don't correct children enough. If you have an antenna, say, that is tuning into, during your first years of development, is tuning into, say, your mother tongue, then perhaps you're picking a lot more once you're tuned into that frequency, that language, than you get from your environment. That's just one idea. It would solve the problems of creativity, because you don't need creativity is the idea that from finite stimuli, you can produce, and from finite elements in language, you can produce an infinite amount of sentences that nobody's ever heard before. We do that all the time, actually. Probably the sentence I just spoke before was never said, even though it's not like groundbreaking or anything. We just have a specific way of saying things that nobody has said before, or they're similar but not quite the same, etc. So that would solve the problem of creativity, because we don't need a pre-formatted module in the head to produce these incredibly creative or infinite amount of sentences. We could be just tuning into something. Then it would remove the problem of the separation between grammar and other types of skills or intelligence, because you could have multiple antennas. You could be tuning into several things. We really don't know how it works, but it would make sense that, because we do perform activities that are not just linked to language, in order to produce language, we also are constantly using other areas of our brain, of our mind, and perhaps it has to do with information, consciousness. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. It also resolves the problem of embodiment, and I'll talk about it in the future. That's like an opposite view of this language module idea. Not quite opposite, because it's still very much anchored in the biological aspect of language and material, but they do focus more on the person's experience and interaction with the environment, and they say that language is embodied, meaning that every single expression that you use has something to do with your experience in the past, or the way your body perceives and feels the environment. But there are problems with that theory, and I think that thinking about language outside of the brain, and the brain just being an interface or an antenna, might solve the problems with this theory too. Okay, then it solves other problems, like the shifting of Broca's and Wernicke's areas that we talked about, because you wouldn't have to have a specific area in the brain. I mean, yes, tentatively, in the sense that you need some kind of tuning device, but it doesn't have to be specific to one area of the brain. It doesn't have to be purely biological even. It would solve the idea of the master module, as I said before, because that would be sort of outside of the brain, in a sense. And it would solve the idea of the trajectory of development, the first vocabulary, then grammar, because you could be tuning into different parts of your language and developing them in parallel. It would also solve a very curious fact, and it's that usually when they measure brains of experts in one domain or another, say mathematicians or polyglots, etc., they realize that the brain is used much less, not more. So one idea is that because if you're an expert at something, you are computing less because you've already did the hard work of learning the subject. Yes, but in the case of polyglots, for example, you think that you would need a lot more brain space for the many different languages that you speak, for example. And that's not the case. It's still a very, very minor portion of the brain that lights up compared to a person who just speaks one language. So that's always been a bit of a mystery. Why do experts in some field use their brain less instead of more? Well, if language is outside of it and you're already tuned to a certain field, for example, why would you need to overburden your brain with processing it? I don't know. It's just an idea again. It would also solve, I think, some gaps in the evolution of languages themselves. I'll talk about that in the future. I'm not a historian and I'm still trying to figure things out, but I think there's real serious flaws in the way evolution of languages is described. So how, say, English came from Anglo-Saxon. There's many gaps in those theories, and something is wrong. So we'll talk about that later. And then the real opposite camp to Chomsky and all the nativists, so the people who think we have a module and that it's innate, is the nurture camp, who says that it's all about learning in your life. Yes, but that still leaves the problem of who created it. So complex. Who created language in such a way that, like, you couldn't have a human being imitate or recreate the complex grammars that we have nowadays. It also keeps the problem alive of why do children learn so fast even though there's not so much stimulus. I mean, there is a lot if you count the hours they spent listening to adults talking. but there's still some aspect of creativity that you can't explain with just nurture. And, well, it would solve many problems, I think, at least to consider this hypothesis. I'm not saying it's true, I don't know, but it doesn't have to be in the brain, in Darwinian evolution, in materialism. Like many things nowadays, it's all narrowed down to materialism, and I think that's a mistake. And it doesn't mean that we have to go to the other extreme and say, well, it's just God, we're not supposed to understand it, because there may be a combination of both. I mean, and I think true sciences combine science and mysticism a bit. When we can't understand what things are, we still don't know what consciousness is. We don't really know what electricity is. We don't really know so many things that we take for granted in this life, including language. We don't know what language is. Anyway, that's just to pick your brain a little bit. I don't have the answers. I'll expand on these topics in the future, but it's a bit of a summary of the idea of a language module, which, as you can see, has many, many flaws, or it hasn't been thought through all the way. Perhaps there is a module. I'm not saying there isn't, but I don't think it would work the way it is claimed. And not just because biological proof hasn't been found, because maybe science is behind, but because language is too complex to be located in just a tiny bit of a brain, because people can have all kinds of injuries and language still works, even though the areas that are supposedly affected don't work. It's just too complex, and it has to do with language allows us to learn, to think, to communicate with others, to get to know each other, to do all kinds of wonderful things that a language module couldn't allow for. We'll talk in the future about what the module would be like inside, and you'll understand why I'm saying there's no way that it's just a module and a bunch of computations alone. There has to be a lot more involved, I think. Even if ultimately it is a computation, it has to do with a lot more than just computer systems. Okay, so I hope you liked this video and that it piqued your curiosity a little bit. Let me know what you think. Is language a module or not? Have you ever thought about it or found out anything about it? Please share on the comments, and click on the like button and subscribe if you haven't yet. And see you soon for more intriguing things about language.